I grew up in a country where the government is, in some form, over 1,000 years old, older than my grandmother's grandmother's grandmother. I do not think you relate to authority the same way when it has existed, in some shape, for that unbroken a stretch of time. Before I go further, I want to be upfront about something. This channel isn't built around fast cuts or flashy editing, and it never will be. What I'm offering you instead is something slower, information I've actually taken the time to get right, because my goal here isn't to entertain you for a few minutes and disappear. It's to help you understand the values of the country I grew up in, one I'm genuinely proud to be from. If that's the kind of channel worth sticking around for, subscribing helps more than you'd think, and it takes about 2 seconds. Alright, let's get into it. Here is the part most retellings leave out, including, honestly, a lot of what gets said about this place, by Icelanders ourselves. Our parliament is usually called the oldest in the world, and it is, in a sense, but the full story is messier than that headline suggests, and I think the messy version is actually more interesting than the clean one. It began in the year 930 at a place called Thingvellir, a wide-open valley about 45 minutes from where Reykjavik sits today. Chieftains from across the island would travel for days on horseback, once a year, to gather there and settle disputes, pass laws, and hold trials. All of it done outdoors, all of it spoken aloud rather than written down for the first couple of centuries, because writing was not yet common practice here at all. There was a role called the law speaker, whose entire job was to memorize the country's complete legal code and recite portions of it aloud from memory each year at the gathering, since there was no written copy anyone could simply look up. Imagine an entire nation's laws existing primarily in one person's memory, checked informally by everyone else who had heard it recited enough times to notice if something changed. That is not how any government I know of operates today, and it worked here for generations. The gathering itself was not only about law either, and I think this part gets lost in translation when it is described in English as simply a parliament. For roughly 2 weeks every summer, temporary camps of tents and turf shelters went up across the valley, and the entire event became something closer to a national festival than a formal legislative session in the modern sense. People came to trade, to arrange marriages, to catch up with relatives from other parts of the country they might not see again for another year, alongside the actual legal proceedings. It was democracy and community life happening in the same field at the same time, which is not really how I picture Parliament working anywhere else I have read about. Thingvellir itself was not chosen randomly either. It sits directly on the boundary where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates meet, a literal rift valley where the ground has been slowly pulling apart for millions of years. Our earliest laws were argued and settled in a place where you could, quite literally, stand with a foot on 2 different continents. Nobody planned that symbolism on purpose. It was simply the flattest, most accessible open ground available at the time. For centuries, this arrangement continued largely unchanged, chieftains and free men gathering each summer to argue, judge, and legislate in the open air. But the version of the story that gets repeated most often skips over what happened next, and I think leaving it out actually undersells how remarkable the full story is. The country's independence eroded slowly over those centuries too, which matters for understanding why the Assembly's power eventually drained away almost entirely before it was ever formally abolished. Iceland came under Norwegian rule in the 13th century, and later under Danish rule when the 2 crowns merged, and with each shift, more real authority moved off the island entirely, decided by kings who had never set foot in the valley where these laws were supposedly still being made. By the time the assembly was formally shut down, it had already been fading into a largely ceremonial gathering for a very long time, a slow decline rather than a sudden one. In 1800, under Danish rule, which Iceland had fallen under centuries earlier, the assembly was abolished entirely by royal decree. Not paused, abolished. For 45 years, there was no Althing at all, no annual gathering, nothing operating under that name or that tradition. If a claim to being the oldest continuous parliament in the world depends on continuity, that gap is a real problem for the claim, and I do not think pretending otherwise does anyone any favors. It was restored in 1845, first as an advisory body with limited real power, moved to Reykjavik rather than the original outdoor valley, and only gradually regained meaningful legislative authority over the following decades as Icelandic independence movements gathered strength. Full independence from Denmark did not arrive until 1944, declared, fittingly, back at Thingvellir itself, the same rift valley where the whole story had started, over 1,000 years earlier. That 1944 moment is worth sitting with for a second, because the symbolism was clearly deliberate this time, unlike the accidental symbolism of the original site. Icelanders chose to declare their republic in the exact same field where chieftains had once argued law on horseback, more than 1,000 years earlier, almost as if the country wanted to formally close the loop, to say that whatever had been interrupted for those 45 years was now, finally, being picked back up in full, on our own terms rather than anyone else's. So is it really the oldest parliament in the world, or is it the oldest idea of one, revived after a real death rather than simply continued without interruption? I think both readings are honest, and I think the second one is actually the more interesting claim to make. What survived was not an unbroken institution. What survived was something closer to a conviction, that this was how a country like ours was supposed to govern itself, strong enough as an idea to be brought back from nothing once the chance came. Other places make similar claims of their own, and it is worth being honest about that too. Some historians point to earlier or parallel assemblies elsewhere in medieval Scandinavia, regional gatherings that functioned in broadly similar ways before Iceland's was ever founded, and to the Isle of Man's Tynwald, which also claims a founding date around the same period and has its own case for the title. None of that erases what happened here. It just means the honest answer to who was truly first is more contested than any single country's tourism board would like to admit, ours included. I remember standing at Thingvellir as a child on a school trip, in that same open valley, being told by my teacher that this was where our laws were first spoken aloud, and not really understanding yet what any of that meant. It was not until years later, learning the fuller version myself, the abolition, the gap, the slow rebuilding, that the place actually became interesting to me, more interesting than the simplified version I was handed as a kid. My teacher also told us something I did not appreciate at the time either, that the assembly was never really democratic in the way we would use that word today. Only free men could attend and speak, and only chieftains held real voting power within it, which meant most of the population, including every woman on the island, had no formal voice there at all for the vast majority of its history. Icelandic women gained limited voting rights in 1915, with full and equal suffrage following in 1920. I think it is worth naming that plainly, rather than letting the age of the institution imply it was always fair, simply because it was old. I think growing up around an institution with a history this long, gap included, shapes something quiet in how people here think about government. There is not much romance attached to politicians personally, and not much cynicism either. More a kind of steady, almost boring expectation that institutions here are simply built to outlast whoever currently occupies them. My grandfather used to say that governments come and go, but the idea of gathering to argue things out in the open has been here since before anyone alive could remember otherwise, and he said it the way you would state a simple fact about the weather, not as something to feel proud or nervous about. It shows up in smaller ways too, ways I only really notice by comparison. Politicians here are not distant figures the way I understand them to be in bigger countries. The parliament building itself sits in the middle of Reykjavik, small enough that you can walk past it on an ordinary errand, and it is genuinely not unusual to run into a member of parliament at a grocery store or a cafe, treated more or less like anyone else you might bump into around town. I do not think that closeness would feel normal in a country where the institution itself felt distant or purely symbolic. Here, because it has always been something people gathered around, literally, in a field, it has never quite lost that sense of being reachable. What I take from the whole story, gap and all, is that the version of history worth keeping is rarely the cleanest one. The honest version, the one with a 45-year hole in the middle of it, tells you something truer about how durable an idea can actually be than a smooth, uninterrupted timeline ever could. It survived being abolished. That is a stranger and better story than simply never having stopped at all.